tradition. If I get stoned and sing all night long, it's a family tradition. At least another hour and a half over here. At least another hour and a half. At least minimum. Monday morning. Monday morning coming down. Oh yeah. Once again, yeah. Mike and old Johnny later. Yeah.
With no place to call my home, but there's one who holds my hand.
And the Queens are gonna be on, but I'm not gonna listen once again. One, I'm not gonna be up. Number two, I don't wanna be disappointed and rage. So it's probably just better off, you know. Maybe it's just better off I just skip it, you know, for at least until like June, maybe like a week before Pulaski Park. 1 week before then, the Monday before, so I'll tune in then. Well, maybe they'll say they're either not going or they're going. And then another thing is, well, whatever. I'm not gonna walk up to anything. I'm just telling you that much. Nope. Not even the guys that I got invited to speak to last year. Not gonna happen. No. I ain't. No. You gotta know. You gotta give people space over there. Yeah, you don't wanna. You don't wanna appear somebody that you're not.
The rugged road through barren lands, the way is dark, the road is steep, but he's become my eyes to see, the strength to climb, my grief to bear. The Savior lives inside me there. In your love I find release, a haven from my unbelief. Take my
Alright, this is, ladies and gentlemen, for YouTube's sake. This is, this is the, 25th, approaching the 26th hour live. Sitting in the chair of infinite thoughts. I did not go anywhere today. I was sitting right here the whole damn time, putting in the hours in, and what was I gonna say there at the end? I forgot, but whatever. Oh yeah. It's 26 hours, so I'm a little bit groggy.
Well, we have about time for one more song, and I want to do.
Welcome back, comrades. It's Maximus. Thank you so much for joining me today. So one thing that has always fascinated me since I was very young was the risk or threat of the Cold War ever actually going hot and what could or should or would have happened. Scary, bloody stuff, let's be honest here, folks. If it ever did come to it, we saw that huge armoured / infantry / well, everything rush coming towards us from the east. It would have been an absolute gong show / nightmare. And I was always curious. You know, I did a little bit of training in the British Army for, large-scale armoured warfare, but nothing compared to what, my previous generations of those who served in the British Army used to learn and were taught about, to dealing with this potential oncoming threat. And I thought I'd start doing a little bit of research, and in doing so, I found some footage via VHS, which I apologise for the quality, about how the British Army dealt with Soviet motorised brigades and armoured brigades and tank divisions and tank battalions. And honestly, it's a little scary, but also extremely interesting. So I thought I'd share it with you guys. Let's have a look at it, shall we?
Troops in Afghanistan are reported to be spreading out across the country and engaging the Muslim rebels. The reports from Western diplomats suggest the Soviet formations are moving in considerable strength. 10,000 men, backed by heavy armour and aircraft, are said to be engaging the rebels.
Eyewitnesses said they counted between 300 and 400 tanks, as well as columns of artillery and troops. Although most of the troops seem to be stationed at key areas around Kabul to establish a defensive perimeter in case of counterattacks from Afghan troops, there was just a faint sign of Christmas cheer among the soldiers at the airport.
Recent events in Afghanistan have made us all aware of the ever-increasing possibility of a limited war in Europe. The Soviets believe they have the ability to take a chunk out of Western Germany. Perhaps, for them, it is only a question of opportunity. Facing one British Corps in BAOR is 3 Shock Army.
Now, for those of you who don't know what BAOR is, it is British Army of the Rhine, which is basically the armed forces that were stationed in Germany for quite some time, that were there as the first initial, defensive force to prevent the shock armies, tank armies, and guards armies punching through the main defensive line of the Cold War era. Honestly, guys, this is scary stuff. When I was based in Germany, pretty much most of my army career, I used to hear stories of, this is where we dug in, this was the road on which, if anything further crossed it, it would be a declaration of war, blah, 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 blah. It was some really scary stuff. And when you hear the first account stories of people in these, specific armies that are set across this borderline, it's just baffling to me that it ever even came to be so close to happening. But the one thing that really interested me, being that I loved my armour, is the fact that these British Army of the Rhine armies or corps were pretty much fully focused on the fact that they knew they were going to be overrun. They knew that they would not hold the line. Their key objective was to shoot and manoeuvre backwards. Shoot and manoeuvre backwards. Take as many vehicles out as they could and pull back again. Some call this a tactical retreat if you've got some pride in your army. I'd call it reality. The truth of the matter was that they knew that they weren't going to be able to hold the line, and they would have to do a retreat backwards and hold off as long as they could until eventually it would go to a strategical, standpoint where nuclear weapons or strategic weapons may have had to be used.
On its northern flank is 2 Guards Army, and on its southern flank is 8 Tank Army. 3 Shock Army sits astride the Hanover Autobahn. Although predominantly a tank-heavy army, its leading formations are motor rifle regiments.
Once again, this video relates to me quite well. If you noticed, he said to the east of the Hanover Autobahn. I was based in Fallingbostel, Germany, which was the major armoured garrison for 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats for the most part. And, that was basically our area of operation for where I was deployed. Of course, not against the Cold War, but for those who were stationed there before me, that was their place to call home for potential World War III and the Cold War to go hot. And, you look in the environment that they had around them in Germany to train in and to prepare and to dig in. And when I say they dug in, they really dug in, because some of the dugouts, trenches, firing positions are still there to this day. Even the concrete tank traps, they're all there. Nothing's moved. And it's just a stark realization to hope that none of this ever has to happen ever again.
The Motor Rifle Regiment is split into 3 main elements: combat support, service support, and the fighting units. Service support includes transport, medical and maintenance companies, the supply platoon and the regimental band, totaling 160 men and 73 B vehicles. Combat support includes the signals, recce and engineer companies, the chemical defence platoon and the regimental artillery. The recce company is 50 strong and mounted in 11 BRDM APCs. The engineer company is equipped with 4 TMMs, which can each bridge a 40-metre gap. Also, it has 2 MTU-20s, capable of bridging a 20-metre gap. The regimental artillery consists of 3 batteries. The anti-tank guided weapons battery comprises 9 BRDM Saga vehicles, each with 6 missiles loaded and 8 ready for reload. This is the same basic vehicle as the recce BRDM, but the turret has been replaced by the Saga launch mechanism. In any role, the vehicle is amphibious, using its hydrojets. It has an anti-armor capability to 3,000 meters. Other versions can carry Swatter missiles.
One misconception that most Western people think of the Cold War and the initial armoured assault would be that it would just be tanks and APCs and hundreds of infantry rushing towards the western side. And of course this just wasn't true. The Russians weren't stupid. This isn't the Second World War where, T-34s and infantry are holding onto the side of vehicles rushing towards, German Tigers and Panthers. It's just not the case. The Russians did have a very strong standoff capability when it came to anti-tank missile systems, of course helos, all that good stuff, where they tried their best to engage targets from long distance before pushing on that armoured advance. And as you can see by this frickin' vehicle here that's loading up 6 anti-tank missiles, you have a very strong capability at 3,000 meters to engage most armoured fighting vehicles of that time period. And you've got to remember that most of these vehicles, although quite small and, not very armoured, they're extremely quick, very manoeuvrable, able to cross rivers, which is obviously a very big natural obstacle on the battlefield anywhere in Europe. And these things could do some serious damage to any of the BOR forces or any of the defending NATO forces at the time. And of course, the most scary thing of this is these vehicles could pull into a recce position, find targets, and before they pull out of that area, take out 6 tanks potentially, before the main force even arrives. That in itself should have took a real wake-up call for most Allied commanders at the time, saying, what do we do to knock out these things? And of course, we went our own side with our own anti-tank guided missiles, our own standoff capabilities, especially when it came to, the Apache helicopter and such, to try and prevent these things from actually ever getting a missile downrange.
The 122mm battery is equipped with 6 122mm
Be right back, gonna make another coffee.
1974. The gun fires HE, heat, smoke and illume to a range of 15,300 meters. Its rate of fire is 7 to 8 rounds per minute. The anti-aircraft battery is in the process of being re-equipped with 8 ZSU 23-4s. This 4-barrel radar-controlled anti-aircraft gun has a range of 2,500 meters and a cyclic rate of fire of 4,000 rounds per minute. In battle, they'll be separated up to 200 meters, and they can be used in the ground roll attack. Now we look at the third and most important element of the motor rifle regiment, the fighting units. These are made up of 3 motor rifle battalions of either tracked BMP or wheeled BTR-60 PB, 1 tank battalion of T-64. It's important at this point to understand the role of the T-72. The T-72 is the cheaper version of the T-64, which was first seen in 1976. 3 Shock Army and its flanking formations are all equipped with T-64 in both motor rifle and tank regiments. Let's have a look at the motor rifle regiment vehicles in more detail. The T-64 shown here is the main battle tank. There are 41 of these in the tank battalion, and each motor rifle battalion gets a tank company of 13 T-64s. This gives each motor rifle company a troop of 4 tanks. There is a crew of 3 men, and it's a little lighter than Chieftain, weighing only 40 tons. It's a low silhouette vehicle, the deck being about chest height. The main armament is a 125mm smoothbore gun, and it fires APDS out to 2,000 meters. It can also fire heat and HESH to about 1,500 meters. It's capable of a top speed of 65 kilometers per hour. It has 2 distinct advantages over previous Soviet tanks in that it's fitted with a laser rangefinder and has an automatic load. It's not an amphibious vehicle but can snorkel to a depth of 5 meters. Here's the BTR-60 PB. This is a big, heavy APC and weighs 10 tons. It has a good cross-country performance despite its bulk. It has a crew of 2 and carries 9 passengers. Its armament is a 14.5 heavy machine gun and a 7.62mm coaxial machine gun. It was designed as an amphibian, and it has a remarkable speed of 10 kilometers per hour in water. It has 2 big disadvantages, however. The passengers can only dismount through the roof, and its great size makes it an easy target. Notice how the squad, on dismounting, moves to the front of the vehicle and advances firing in a straight line. This is normal dismounted Soviet tactics. The squad is followed closely by the APC, which can give a heavy weight of overhead fire support.
Now, the ironic thing here is, guys, Soviet tactics are very different to Western tactics when it comes to infantry dismount and mechanized assaults. These infantry soldiers are patrolling ahead of this BTR, with the BTR firing overhead. For the most part, Western tactics were very different. We tended to do, and still to this day do, the battle bus procedure, which basically means drop the troops off as quickly as possible, deploy them into a staggered or line formation beside the vehicle, and allow the vehicle to then retreat back under heavy fire, not firing over the heads of your troops, and then literally bugging out to a new location to either support from distance, provide overwatch, and even potentially pick up casualties. The Russians were not in really that same kind of doctrine. They tried their best to support their troops all the way up until the trenches or the firing lines they were going towards. Risky, I must admit, for sure. If infantry are going against infantry, you want, for the most part, for that to be the same case. But if your BTRs and your APCs, like the BMPs and such, are rolling up close in with the enemy infantry, you're risking putting them up against anti-tank fire. Prime example, the warrior infantry section, when dropped off, the warrior would pull up, open the rear doors, troops would pull out to the left and right, warrior would be engaging targets as it can as they do so, it would then close door, reverse out of there as quickly as possible under smoke screen or fire, and then pull into an overwatch position to watch their troops advance. Once the troops have taken on the position or in-depth positions, the warrior would then be radioed to pull back into their group with the reorg of the platoon/section and pick up the boys and move on to the next objective. Russian doctrine was very different, and although risky, could have potentially been quite effective if they had hundreds of these kinds of formations moving forward, as once again, the Western formations would never be able to stop that kind of advance.
This is the BMP. It's the newest Soviet APC. Its armour comprises a 73mm smoothbore gun that has 40 rounds mixed HE and HESH. Maximum range of 1,300 metres, but effectiveness falls off sharply at 800 metres. A coaxial 7.62 gun and a Saga anti-tank guided missile. The vehicle carries 4 Saga missiles. The maximum range is 3,000 metres, but it has a dead space of 0 to 500 metres because it takes the gunner 4 to 5 seconds to bring the missile under control. However, the 73mm gun compensates for this deficiency. Because the Saga gunner must track the missile to the target, smoke will defeat the weapon. On the other hand, the gunner is protected. The BMP has only light armour, and a 7.62mm high-velocity round hitting its side at 90 degrees will penetrate it. The 73mm gun is not stabilised, and the Saga must be tracked so that the vehicle has to be stationary when firing both these weapons. The BMP has no night sight for either weapon. It's especially vulnerable from behind because its rear doors are in fact flexible fuel tanks. The troops inside have the added discomfort of sitting on top of the ammunition storage space. Its strengths are its firepower, mobility, and its low silhouette. Now we'll come on to tactics. The formation of the motor rifle advance begins with recce patrols. Some 10 kilometers behind the recce patrols will be found the leading battalion group, on either side of which is the march security detachment. 20 kilometers behind this group will come the main body of the motor rifle regiment, and behind them, the rear guard. The lead battalion group advances with a motor rifle platoon as its recce patrol. This is followed some 5 kilometers behind by the point, which is a motor rifle platoon and a tank. The next comes the vanguard, comprising a motor rifle company, less one platoon, a tank platoon, less one tank, and the anti-tank platoon. Behind this will be the main body with all the combat, service support and artillery weapons. Behind them will be the rear guard. The vanguard company will have the first contact. They will apply the standard Soviet drill and deploy into platoon columns behind a tank. The company will then adopt standard battle formation and attack. Note the company commander is in the rear center. The company will attack from as much as 1 kilometer away. Little use is made of cover or fire and maneuver, and infantry will not dismount until made to do so by the strength of the defense or the nature of the terrain. This will cause the tanks and the advance to slow down. In both types of assault, mounted or dismounted, the final 250 meters will be made with all weapons firing. The company frontage will be anything from 250 to 500 meters, depending on the terrain and the enemy's strength. If the vanguard attack fails, they will remain in position to cover the leading battalion attack, which would normally develop within about 1 hour. If this fails, the regimental attack will differ in that it will be on a wider front. There will be a reserve echelon and it will be supported by air and ground recce to locate targets such as headquarters and gunner batteries. Elaborate deception plans will be employed. It will be preceded by a formal artillery barrage lasting up to 40 minutes. The basic drill of deploying from the line of march into battle formations will be unlikely to change. We ourselves must be able to withstand the enemy's devastating artillery barrage. This can only be done by proper overhead protection in our defensive positions. The Soviet tactic of a fast, massed armoured thrust on a comparatively small front enables us to use our anti-tank weapons to devastating effect. It will not be so much a question of great accuracy as one of weight of firepower. If we can make the enemy infantry dismount, this will slow the advance, giving our machine guns and anti-tank weapons the best opportunity to halt the attack. Once dismounted, the infantry also has no means of communicating, and this makes his command and control almost impossible. Remember, the company commander is the only person with 2 radio nets in his vehicle. If all the OC's vehicles were killed, all vehicles would have to go onto the same battalion net. Remember also, the company commander is the one vehicle with 2 antennas. Here we're watching a UK battle group making the best use of its artillery and anti-tank fire. The infantry has been made to dismount and is coming under heavy small arms fire.
3 FPF fire over.
Golf 2, Wilco,
Fire mission battery.
Hello 2, this is 2-2, fire mission battery over. Switch up.
FPF fire.
FPF, fire over. Switch up. Shot out.
In conclusion, an intelligent assessment of the Soviet Army's weaknesses and a ruthless exploitation of them can more than compensate for NATO's comparative strength deficiency.
So folks, I hope you learned a little bit about how motorized, mechanized and armored guard companies or divisions moved towards our Western boys and girls back in the day. Like I've mentioned before, thank God it never happened, because it would have just gone to epic proportions when it comes to casualties, death rates, losses, vehicle destruction. It would just be a catastrophe. And you know, it's enough to know that nowadays we've seen the history of this thing kind of never really happening and hoping it never would, and hopefully it will follow suit for the rest of time, but we will see. Guys, if you want to support my channel, please feel free to go check out my Patreon account. Military content and YouTube tend to not get along very well. And thank you so much for watching today. If you want to follow me on my Facebook, feel free to, and come have a chat with me on my Discord. Link is in the description box below. All the best, and bye-bye.
Alright, history videos, yeah, unwinding this session.
Welcome back everyone, it's Maximus here again. I've been recently talking quite a bit about Cold War doctrine and specific tactics used by the Russians back in the day, or what they would have used more to the point. It is scary stuff, as I've mentioned in previous videos, but let's get really down to the nitty-gritty of what potentially could or would have happened in terms of specific scenarios during the Cold War era, and, you know, what would have happened if it really kicked off. The Cold War was a fascinating time for doctrinal development, it really was, and it was very crucial to understand how and why they have the doctrine that we have today in terms of both Russian doctrine and NATO doctrine, particularly as we start looking at whether we can actually fight our adversaries in a combat environment with the new modern technology and tactics that we have. So I'm going to revisit Cold War battle plans, talk a little bit about how they've changed and the technology and doctrinal changes that drove that change, specifically the Fulda Gap, the strategic picture of majority of the tactics used back then, the 7 days to Rhine, including the tactical nuclear war readiness and the GI-UK gap. I'll also talk a little bit about Western doctrine in terms of defence in depth, active defences, air-land battle, full spectrum operations, and then where next? Where are we at today in terms of this ever potentially happening again? So first of all, let's talk about the Fulda Gap. So, it's 1979. Germany is divided. On the west, the combined NATO forces of the US, UK, West Germans, Belgian and Dutch. On the east are the East German, Polish and the forces of the USSR, with the Czech to the south. If the Warsaw Pact is to advance into NATO territory, then it must do so with the West Germany divide, because it's here that the US reinforcements will arrive and must not be allowed to arrive. A funnel created by the neutral states of Austria, still expected to probably be invaded by the Warsaw Pact, Yugoslavia and Baltic means everything comes down to East-West Germany border. The topography of Germany means that the north is preferred. Wide open plains are ideal for mechanised forces of the Warsaw Pact, but initially US reinforcements will be able to fly into the major US Air Force base of Frankfurt in the south until the heavy armour arrives by sea. For the Warsaw Pact advance, there is the defending 5th Corps in the Central Army Group and the advancing Soviet 8th Guards Army and the Rhone Mountains in the Volgasburg. In the narrow valley between the two lies the small city of Fulda. If the Cold War have ever turned hot, then this small city would have been absolutely obliterated. In terms of the overall strategic picture of the Cold War, the group of the Soviet forces in Germany existed for one reason: to prevent the inevitable war from spreading into the USSR itself. The minute things kick off, no matter who starts it, the Soviet forces are getting across that border and ruining someone else's house. Thank you very much. Unsurprisingly, the rest of the Warsaw Pact backed up this plan. Nobody can win the eventual war by steamrolling over the other military and invading the motherland. So what does victory actually mean in a strategic picture? This is where I want to mention the end game. the whole plan of World War III was to avoid total nuclear annihilation and to be in the stronger position such that, when the UN steps in, one team is awarded better terms in the inevitable peace that gives two victory conditions. 1. If you are the USSR, then you must grab as much land from NATO as possible and prevent reinforcements by the US. 2. If you are NATO, then you must halt the Soviet advance and defeat it. You must keep US reinforcements lines clear so that heavy armoured units held at lower readiness can actually reach Europe. Okay, so let's talk about these 7 days to the Rhine. Let's just imagine you are the USSR. High tensions are already suddenly and unexpectedly leading to a war as NATO launches a series of nuclear strikes on the Vistula River in Poland, cutting off access to Poland and East Germany from forces in the USSR, and invades East Germany, a common planning scenario involving an enemy first strike. Your first move is to shift and fight to NATO, breaking civilian morale, pour troops over the border and deny the Atlantic to the US reinforcement convoys. This is in fact the exact story of a 1979 Soviet battle plan which aims to present a fate to actually get the US and UN stopping to get them in 7 days at the Rhine, basically D-Day plus 7, and getting to Spain by D-Day plus 14. In the 10 years since the release, there has been some great analysis of this plan, one of which I'm not going to go over too in depth today, but a very interesting analysis nonetheless. There are 3 interesting elements that I want to really worth a mention here. Tactical nuclear strikes. Soviet doctrine assumed that both sides could use widespread tactical and strategic nuclear strikes without escalation to a full strategic nuclear war, ending at what was called in a mutual assured destruction, or MAD. And it basically is MAD because it means the end of days. It would be nukes falling on cities, just hell. This isn't at all, though, what NATO assumptions were, so it's a good thing that nothing really ever did kick off, because NATO would have escalated. The initial NATO nuclear strikes, along with the Vistula, assumed a mindset in which Poland's populace was seen as a forgivable casualty of war to effectively degrade the Soviet ability to reinforce the front line. Again, very at odds with mainstream NATO thinking, especially in a first strike scenario. There were some very interesting tactical nuclear weapons created by both sides. Because of this planning, assumption of a lot of cities are in the firing line. NATO destroys Warsaw and 10 other major Polish cities, as well as a number of other Warsaw Pact cities. A Soviet response target is major population centres and military targets to break morale. Most of Europe, and obviously going for the mainland of the United States and obviously the United Kingdom. Pretty scary stuff, and like I said, thank God it never happened, but the ability for tactics back then to use these strategic nuclear weapons was pretty scary stuff. You know, the Russian doctrine wasn't to nuke the homeland of the US, it was to basically strategically nuclear blast everything in their way to make a rolling move onto enemy positions in Europe, which, when you think about it, troops running into radioactive wastelands, which would be left, is that worth the risk? I mean, to me, it's just craziness. But, you know, back then, I guess looking after the motherland of the USSR was a lot more important than your skin falling off. Interestingly, though, the Soviets' targets were many expected countries: Germany, Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands. They also targeted Austria, a neutral state, which is really interesting, and Italy, nowhere near the battle area but able to launch a counterattack via Austria. And they did not target France or the UK. France by this point had stepped outside of the NATO military planning setup, but the UK was a key part of NATO plans, hosting US nuclear weapons and defending the Atlantic resupply routes. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces fully expected to fight in areas which had been subjected to nuclear strikes and completely obliterated, including biological and chemical attacks. Both sides undertook testing of the nature of fighting in an irradiated area. The Soviet Union in the Kursk nuclear exercise, and the US through the Desert Rock exercises. The requirement to fight in a CBRN contaminated area drives British armoured vehicles, including today's Challenger 2 tank, Warrior and armoured fighting vehicles, to contain a kettle. Hence why we have a BV inside our vehicles, guys, is because we didn't back in the day want to have to get out of our vehicle to start making a brew. This is a fact. This is why we design these things, is so we can make a brew in the Cold War. This allows the troops to live in a boil-in-a-bag meal setup and continue fighting for up to 3 days, and of course, making a brew. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about readiness. Let's be honest here, both sides were in a constant state of extreme readiness. However, the Soviet plan assumes that after an initial NATO attack, they can mobilize their forces, counterattack East Germany, and fight through NATO positions to reach the Rhine in 7 days, and that was their target. Bearing in mind the logistical tail and replacement of casualties, which would be extremely high, that timescale is absurdly fast. 7 days is insane. Soviet forces were kept at extreme high readiness, of course, with follow-up of reinforcements really not too far behind. Snap exercises were called periodically to test readiness, and these continue to this day in Russia at a much larger scale than in many, possibly all, NATO countries. This plan, as its real name back in the day was known the CSLA Plan of Action for a War Period, does not contain any thoughts on how NATO's first strikes would actually degrade the forward fighting units, which of course it would have. It also does not contain any thoughts on the Warsaw Pact losses as they fight through the NATO defences. Indeed, a core part of this plan is that NATO's defensive plans are a sham, which of course they weren't. Still, the assumptions required to even begin considering reaching their target in 14 days indicates an impressive ramping up of military effort from the USSR side. NATO's plan in West Germany requires a holding off of the Warsaw Pact for those 14 days until US high readiness troops can arrive. Some air mobile troops would be available sooner, but given the roughly 7-day Atlantic transit time, this assumes that the majority of the US armed forces in the first wave of reinforcements aren't ready to set sail for a week. This significantly lowers the Soviet planning assumptions. Now let's talk about the GIUK Gap. This is known as the Greenland-Iceland-UK Gap, and it's the name of the set of straits through which any vessel from the Baltic or Northern Soviet fleets wanting to enter the Atlantic would have to travel. Given that the entire NATO plan hinges on getting seaborne reinforcements from the US, Soviet ships, submarines, and aircraft very much did want to pass through those straits. In the event of war, Soviet submarines would attempt to track and indicate US ships, while Bear bombers, huge beasts that they are, launched anti-ship missiles from long range after flying around Norway and through the gap. Bear bombers would frequently test out NATO readiness as they still do today. The UK was a heavy contributor to the defence of the GIUK Gap, particularly in the forms of anti-submarine warfare and aircraft interception. These requirements drove capability requirements during the Cold War. For example, the English Electric Lightning, a rapid but fuel-guzzling interceptor, or the Type 23 frigate, a specialised ASW platform. Of course, funnily enough, today we still have the same kind of things going on, such as the Typhoon and the Astuart-class submarines, and the pretty much more nuisance factor of the Tu-95s coming in to piss off the UK, because nowadays that's all they're really doing. Detection of vessels in this gap also led to the placement of underwater microphones, otherwise known as Sound Surveillance Systems or SOSUS, which the US maintains to this day. Other elements of this include microphones near the Straits of Gibraltar to intercept the Mediterranean fleet. Now let's look at the opposite side of the coin, the Western doctrine. Of course, defence in depth is very, very important here. I mean, the late defensive thinking of the end of World War II, for the most part, was the successful defensive strategic doctrine that basically said, put the sea in the way of us and maintain air superiority, which clearly isn't going to be the case in this particular scenario. Defense in depth. It would be an exaggeration to say that Russia invented defense in depth, but it has certainly perfected it. Defense in depth is basically the strategic surrender of ground or tactical retreat by defending forces to slowly wear out an attacking enemy. It aims to slow down the attacker, cause them to lose momentum, ammunition, casualties, and buy time for friendly forces to regain momentum and, for example, attack the enemy's flanks. In 1811 to 1812, Russia used this strategy with excellent intelligence and good use of mobilization and strategic reserves to defeat Napoleon's Grand Army, giving rise to the first ever Sankey diagram as a result. This helped them to eventually defeat Napoleon by using their slowly mobilized war machine to support armies marching through Poland, Lithuania, Prussia, and into France. 130 years later, the Soviet Union adopted the same strategy to absorb and then defeat the German invasion, though more through a necessity rather than to just general planning. When Western nations looked at the Soviet horde that would invade East Germany in the 50s and 60s, it looked to this tried and tested plan to defend. The issues with defense in depth are that it requires the political will to give up large areas of land and tactical patience with the sacrifice of units. Unfortunately, Western forces in Germany had increasingly less of these units as the Cold War went on. They weren't able to give up sufficient ground to stall the attack. As forces became more mobile, the ability to stall the enemy was reduced without being actually counted as a loss. suddenly the Yom Kippur War kicks off, and is finished almost as soon as it had started. Within a month, Egypt had invaded to retake land, rebuffed a heavy enemy Israel force with air support, and eventually been overcome. That conflict immediately showed the utility of the anti-tank guided missile and surface-to-air missiles, which had advanced leaps in the previous decade. So along comes active defense, exploiting the West's better technology, a dubious claim really at that time, to blunt the Soviet spearhead. The plan was to use mobile defensive positions to cluster Soviet forces and use the suddenly very powerful anti-tank guided missiles to their advantage to tear them to pieces. You then pick up your defensive position and find a new target. Obviously, Soviet forces had their own ATGMs and SAMs and were actually pretty dang good. Analysts were predicting that the huge attritional battle would actually benefit the Russians and their absurd number of tanks, helicopters and IFVs, and Western commanders didn't like the idea of giving up ground and sacrificing units. It felt like losing. The enemy maintained the momentum, we weren't in control, and that just won't do. And in comes air-land battle, which rewrote the defensive rules. Air-land battle says that the best way to defend is to fight fire with fire and attack an enemy attack. In fact, it's a pretty big shift in thinking that harks back to the German stormtrooper tactics in World War I. Avoid the enemy main thrusts and forces, and instead attack a weakly defended area, like the flank of a logistics site or reinforcement staging areas. This principle was very similar to active defense, but more aggressive and offensive. The main premise was that as well as slowing down the enemy by degrading their ability to keep frontline troops supplied, rapid attacks would exploit the one strength that NATO had over the Warsaw Pact. At this point, the initiative and decisiveness of unit-level commanders. This improved command and control and allowed them to, or so the thinking went, to be more agile and confuse the enemy. The funny part is, this is probably one of the most important doctrinal developments for understanding the way we do things today and now. It drove a focus on deep ability to engage long-range and reasonably precise effects through cruise missiles, MLRS, deep strike interdiction aircraft, or close air and ground coordination on finding and exploiting enemy weaknesses. So overall, what has really changed from back then to today when dealing this kind of, doctrine, this kind of capability? Well, really, not much has changed. Of course, technology has changed a lot since back in those days. We have, drones and all sorts of fancy technology that allows us to better our situational awareness on the battlefield and provide a better glance at what is to expect in a potential new Cold War scenario. But overall, when it comes to, the tactics used, not much is really ever going to change. And of course, nuclear threat is always going to be there, but I don't think it'll ever happen. We all know it's an end game, it's going to be the end of days. But, tactics and doctrine haven't changed too much. I mean, you look at the footage of tanks and armoured fighting vehicles training in Poland and such for a, potential escalation of what we see going on out there. It's just, there's not much changing. Even when I was going through my training in the British Army, you look at some of the tactics and the sort of, doctrine we used back then, it was very similar to what they used in the Cold War back in the 60s and 70s and so on and so forth. And it's still to this day very, very similar to what we use. Lessons can be learned from the Cold War as to how to do things and how not to do things and the different type or even style of tactics that could be used. But let's be honest here, we don't ever want to get into that scenario again. If we do, we know it's not going to be a good time. So it's just interesting to kind of look back at history and see where we've progressed from then to today. And of course, with technology, we've progressed way further than what we could ever imagine back in the Cold War days in terms of standoff capabilities, strategic capabilities. But when it comes to boots on the ground, tracks on the ground, and aircraft in the sky, the basic principle is very, very similar. And if it came to it, it would probably be a very similar sort of setup, layout, and strategic capability that is given from our commanders up above to deal with this potential threat. So that's it for today, guys. I hope you learned a little bit about how the Cold War would have worked and kind of the methods that they would have used in terms of USSR Soviet doctrine for, the invasion of Europe and World War III, basically. If you wish to support my channel, please feel free to go check out my Patreon account. It is in the description box below for a link. And any donations towards my channel is much appreciated, and thank you so much in advance. I'd love to hear your opinion on this video, guys. If you find it a little dry and boring, please feel free to give me some feedback in the comments section. If you want to follow me on Facebook, feel free to do so. And if you want to come for a chat, come hit my Discord account. We come have some games, have a chat, whatever else it may be. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks again for watching, and bye-bye. Welcome back, everyone. It's Maximus. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you stopping by. So, today we are talking about main battle tanks again. And, finally, I have got round to the beautiful Russian T-72 main battle tank. Now, in this video you will notice not all T-72s shown in the footage are Russian, and that's obviously because this tank is so widespread across the globe in terms of its usage. Now, I have to admit, I've been very nervous making this video. It's one of those tanks where you really don't want to insult its heritage. It's been such a formidable main battle tank around the world, you really don't want to piss off the people who have also fallen in love with this tank, because I myself love the T-72. Now, as always, I'll go through my video and the three basic concepts that I run with. A little bit about its history, because if I was to talk about this vehicle's history for a very long time, I'd be here for about 3 years. It is drenched in history. Secondly, I'll go over its specifications and its features, and finally I'll put my own spin and opinion on what I think of the tank. So, first of all, let's just say that the T-72 is pretty much the most widely exported second to third generation main battle tank on this planet. Fact. They are everywhere. Its origins dates to the Soviet Union's military expansion during the Leonid Brezhev's premiership. From its Object 172 prototype to the present, an estimated 30,000 T-72s have been made between Nazizhgytil and Mahazlev plant in Kharkiv, Ukraine, and Poland, and the former Yugoslavia, India, and Iran. Now, according to certain sources, one in particular, Forecast International, says that the Russian Federation maintains the largest fleet of T-72s currently, with 13,000 of them left over from the 1990s and between 4,000 to 6,000 mothballed as reserves, until Moscow decides to scrap these vehicles. The Russian T-72 main battle tank was produced at the Malzev HMB plant based in Kharkov, Ukraine, and at the UKBM Nazizhgytil Russian Federation, and produced under the license in a number of countries. It first entered production in, surprisingly, 1972. The T-72 originated as a design to counter the expensive nature of the technologically advanced T-64 of 1963. The T-64 was the primary spearhead of the Soviet main battle tank and introduced the D-81T 125mm smoothbore main gun. To this point, Western offerings relied on the rifled 105mm system and had since gone to adopt the 120mm smoothbore design themselves. The T-64 also coupled the 125mm main gun with an automatic loader, which reduced the crew size to 3 and contained an overall operational weight to manageable levels while promoting a reduced low profile on the horizon. The prototype T-72 was born as the Object 172, which evolved into the modified Object 172M. Evaluations of this new vehicle were undertaken in 1971 and concluded the tank to be functional and capable, leading it to its adoption as the T-72 for the Red Army. The T-72 was first unveiled to the public in 1977 on the May Day parade and, amazingly, would retain its frontline status until the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1991. Externally, the T-72 followed a tried and true doctrine of decades-long Soviet tank design. Much attention was always given to the very low profile from any angle, and the additional adding of an autoloader mechanism lessened the crew turret to only 2 personnel and the driver in the front center of the hull. Western tanks generally utilized the main loading system of a manual loader, which required the 4th crew member and the 3rd person in the turret. The auto-loading feature was extremely technologically advanced for its time. It devised a carousel-type arrangement containing the charge in an upper rung and projectile in a lower rung, brought together at the breech. The T-72 represents a combination of efficient design with a powerful main gun. As the successor of the T-64, a model that was never exported outside the Soviet Union, the T-72's chassis hull layout were quite revolutionary for its time. The tank maintained its low profile and dome turret, common amongst most Soviet tanks throughout the Cold War. However, the thing that really did separate this tank apart was that 125mm smoothbore 2A46 main gun and its autoloader with the 22-round magazine. The additional rounds were stored in the 3-man crew compartment, totaling its load to 39 rounds. When engaged in combat, a well-trained crew can fire roughly around 8 125mm rounds in a minute. The T-72's cramped interior reinforces the fact that Russian tankers really had to operate their vehicles in relative discomfort that may render them a little less ineffective in prolonged missions. However, in this day and age, it really wasn't cared for. They wanted to get as many tanks on the battlefield as possible, and crew comfort really wasn't on their top to-do list. The T-72's driver sits in the front of the vehicle, exiting and entering via a circular hatch above the distinctive V splash guard, which is, as I said, distinctive. The V splash guard is one of the key features prominent to seeing that it is a T-72. The driver then runs the tank using 2 levers and a 7-speed gear stick, with only a detachable TNPO 168V periscope for visibility, which isn't much, guys, especially with such a low profile vehicle. A separate night vision periscope was also provided. This is why drivers frequently poke their heads out when on the move. It's not common that you would see these vehicles hatched down for the fact that it was very difficult to see when trying to look through the periscopes. The gunner and commander are within the turret. All sights, switches and systems are within arm's reach and designed that way so that they can be used in both pitch black and in potentially an NBC environment. I don't know if you've ever been aware when inside a vehicle with a gas mask on, but it can be very difficult to see where switches are. The commander has the best access to either of the machine guns at his disposal. A turret-mounted 12.7mm NSV and a 7.62mm PKT beside the 2A46 smoothbore main gun. During the 1970s, the T-72's armour was substantial and resistant to most anti-tank weapons like the M72 Law or any recoilless rifle. In keeping with the Soviet approach to the tank design, a cast-round steel turret allowed for a very strong frontal armour, but very strong frontal armour only. The cast steel on either side of the T-72's main gun had a thickness between 350 and 380mm. The slope glacis of the T-72 was a welded slab of rolled steel that sandwiched an additional glass-reinforced plastic layer set at a 68-degree angle. This gave at least 550mm of armour on the upper glacis and 80mm on the lower segment beneath the tank's headlights. The flanks of the sides of the T-72 consisted of rolled steel plates that were quite thin, just 80mm on the upper half and 20mm behind the road wheels. The hull's bottom and the rear of the engine compartment only had 20mm of thickness. On paper, the T-72 could absorb frontal direct hits from a 105mm tank round, but there are sources that believe that this claim is really lopsided considering the battles fought in June 1982 between Israeli tanks and Syrian T-72s in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. The rest of the tank is impervious to most small arms and even 25mm cannon fire. Should a Russian-made RPG-7V, whose warhead could actually burn through 11 inches of steel, score a direct hit on a T-72 without ERA or explosive reactive armour, it is said that it wouldn't penetrate the armour or the glacis, unless, of course, a tandem warhead is aimed at the vulnerable part of the vehicle. The larger RPG-29 is fully capable of knocking out T-72, as well as most third-generation main battle tanks. Besides, though, no tank really is invincible, and in 2013 a Syrian Arab Army T-72 was destroyed when a rebel slid a hand grenade down its barrel. Later variants like the T-72B or B3 equipped with the Contact 5 panels can withstand anti-tank guided missile hits, and perhaps a very poorly aimed 120mm heat round. The T-72 might have a revolutionary main battle tank once, but really the rigours and ravages of the past 40 years have really served its purpose to expose its weaknesses. The original shortcomings form the basis for every T-72 upgrade. There's an extremely uncomfortable interior, a smaller diesel power plant compared to most NATO tanks, a low and round turret that prevents the main gun from adequately depressing, composite steel armour that performs inadequately really against current anti-tank guided missiles, poor accuracy in certain environments when thermal gun sights were not available, an autoloader whose efficiency at some times was contrasted by the risk of exploding the whole tank when its magazine is struck by a projectile. However, what can this tank do, and why has it been so prominent, and why has it done so well through the history? The original T-72 that caused a stir in the West ran on a 6 road-wheel power configuration by a 780 horsepower V12 diesel engine and could travel at around 60 kilometers an hour on rough terrain. Guys, that is very, very fast for a main battle tank of that day, and this is one of the key attributes for the T-72's strengths. It is bloody fast and it is bloody agile. It can go just about anywhere, guys. Its torsion bar suspension made for very clunky movements at top speed, but it did emphasise on its ruggedness. It could go anywhere, take the bumps and keep on going. Although the engine exhaust was exposed, the Russians were clever enough to retool it as a smokescreen. Yes, just like most tanks nowadays, they can actually produce diesel onto the exhaust to give them a screen of smoke that will actually allow them to retreat. And yes, the vehicle was protected with a nuclear, biological and chemical warfare protection system. This allowed the crew to still operate the vehicle if there was potentially some sort of chemical threat. And let's be honest here guys, this vehicle was pretty much primed for the Cold War and potentially World War III. And it was no holes barred. If they were going to go into all-out nuclear / chemical warfare against other vehicles, it was definitely an option, and you know, they wanted to protect their crews, and rightly so. One of the key attributes that failed on this system though was the autoloader. It kind of chewed into its capability of being able to protect itself in that environment. Every time a projectile was fired, an empty casing would have to be ejected out the back. This actually exposed the vehicle's hull and turret to allow that chemical to get inside. Only momentarily, but enough to cause it some potential damage to the crew inside if they were not correctly NBC'd up. The T-72 utilised the 125mm smoothbore gun and could fire a healthy dose of projectile of around 39 maximum. This included the HEAT FS, or High Explosive Anti-Tank Fin Stabilized, the HE Frag, or High Explosive Fragmentation, and the APF SDS, or Armoured Piercing Fin Stabilized Discarding Sabot. Common to other Soviet tanks, the T-72 main gun could also fire a guided anti-tank missile from the barrel. To counter any potential armoured or unarmoured battlefield threat, usually a mix of projectiles was carried by all T-72 tanks to allow them to pretty much engage just about anything. Now, in terms of variants, the T-72 obviously had a lot of different models. The initial production models of 1973 were pretty much known as just T-72. The Ural name sometimes is also associated to these vehicles, and they were fielded with an optical coincidental rangefinder. This mark was then followed by the improved T-72A of 1979, which featured a laser rangefinder and an electronic fire control system for improved accuracy on the move. Additionally, frontal protection was improved through the use of composites. The T-72A was designated the T-72M, or modernized to Warsaw Pact inventories, and the export version became the T-72G. The T-72M1 was the T-72M with increased armour, and the T-72AV was given the explosive reactive armour blocks to furthermore produce best protection. The T-72AK proved a command tank with increased communication equipment. So I won't go too much in the different designations and models, but you're probably wondering, Maximus, why has this thing lasted so long? Well, owing to its popularity in modern conflicts, the T-72's combat record is a matter of interpretation. On one hand, so many have been destroyed in combat. It doesn't help that the armor protection along its rear and flanks was pretty much inadequate. On the other hand, developing countries prefer the T-72, and like the Russians are finding ways to currently improve it. Here's the thing, one of the greatest things that the T-72 has on its side is it's affordable. A T-72 could be delivered to a client for as little as $500,000 per tank. New versions cost nearly $2 million each, perhaps more, or potentially perhaps less. The T-72 remains a fearsome adversary, as well as its recent played significant role in Ukraine's war with Russia. Simply, it doesn't need all this high-tech technology. If it has a 125mm gun, can move quickly and engage targets, and shoot and skew, it's still a formidable main battle tank. I mean, let's put it this way, the US, for example, is still helping to actually improve the fire control systems for the Iraq new T-72s. Even Israeli firms such as IMI, whose expertise with armoured vehicles is pretty much unrivaled, can be contracted to modernise the Soviet-era T-72s. Ethiopia, Angola, Sudan, South Sudan and Venezuela have paid for hundreds of T-72s to bolster their own ground forces. The continuous adoption and improvement of the T-72 is incomparable with any other main modern tank. Iran is recognised as the last manufacturer of the T-72, with its own licensed production ending in 2012. Even developing countries that can really barely afford to feed their own people are still buying these things. It isn't a stretch to see the T-72 continuing in future battlefields somewhere else. So really guys, overall the T-72 is one of those tanks that has just lasted through the ages, and it will for a lot longer, I can almost guarantee it. And it is because of that main reason. It just costs a lot less than some of the more highly modernised, highly effective main battle tanks out there. Countries don't need these high-tech weapon systems to engage what they need them to engage, and this is similar to the conversation I had previously about the close air support role. There's no point spending billions and billions of dollars on these high-tech pieces of equipment if they're not going against other high-tech pieces of equipment. The tanks that most of these countries are buying as a T-72 are being utilised to engage other T-72s. And yes, you'd think, well, why would they not buy better? Well, because they can't afford it. And the T-72 is one of those legacy vehicles because there are so many made that they can buy off the shelf, ready to go. Everything's set and ready to go. And there are many distributors and companies out there willing to upgrade these tanks to allow them to better themselves, to allow them engaging targets better, etc., etc. The fact that this tank continues to roll to this day is incredible to me. I've got to admit, its mobility and speed is one of the key things I love about the T-72, just the speed of these things and how well they cross terrain. I've seen them in Poland used by other countries and how well they traverse cross terrain compared to a Challenger 2. The Challenger 2 is this big, dopey, fat thing, which I love to death, but be honest, from a mechanical standpoint and, an engineering standpoint, it is slow, it is fat, and it does not like going through thick mud. Anything more than about 2 or 3 feet, it's going to get stuck. T-72 will pretty much chew through most stuff, and because of its low profile, it can just go just about anywhere. Unfortunately, because of its low profile, it does have a little bit less gun depression, but I don't think it's a huge downfall for this tank. The huge downfall for this tank is its armor protection. It really does have its ass handed to it when it comes to protecting itself. Some of those millimeter thicknesses of armor thickness on this tank was just shocking to even say, let alone know. It's just very, very worrying that, most modern day countries are even starting to look at, continuing to upgrade these vehicles. Really, in my own opinion, as much as I love the T-72, it is a tank that should be really trying to get upgraded